Hello, welcome to our Intercultural Week presentation this week, and this is sponsored by the Red Nations Club. We're happy to have Margot Hill tell us a little bit about the person that the street in front of our college is renamed. I'm just going to take a minute and say that I've been on committees for maybe 20 years here at the college looking at the renaming. And so now that it's finally happened, we are going to be excited to hear more about who this person is. I want to start by acknowledging, we are honored to acknowledge that the Community College of Spokane and our main campuses for Spokane Falls and Spokane Community College are located on the traditional and sacred homelands of the Spokane tribe. We also provide services in a region that includes the traditional and sacred homelands of the Confederate tribes of Colville Reservation and the Kalispel tribe. We pay our respects to tribal elders, both past and present, as well as to all Indigenous people today. This land holds their cultural DNA, and we are honored and grateful to be here on their traditional lands. We give thanks to the legacy of the original people and their descendants and pledge to honor their stewardship and values. With that, I want to introduce one of our Red Nations Club members, Sage White, and she is going to introduce our speaker today.
Hello, my name is Sage. I go by Sage. I would like to introduce Margot Hill. She is a Spokane tribal member and grew up on the Spokane Indian Reservation. She serves as the Associate Director of Small Urban, Rural, and Tribal Center on Mobility, SURCOM. Dr. Hill served as the Spokane Tribal Attorney for 10 plus years and as a Coeur d'Alene Tribal Court Judge. In this capacity, she's received letters of declination from the U.S. Attorney's Office and worked to bring perpetrators to justice in the complex criminal law scheme of the Indian country. Ms. Hill earned her Juris Doctorate from Gonzaga School of Law and her Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from Eastern Washington University. Her bachelor degree is in political science from the University of Washington. Margot Hill is a faculty at Eastern Washington University, where she teaches planning law and legislation, administrative law, community development, tribal planning classes, and American Indian law. Thank you.
Heo putis in kasifu putis in kwali putis lichla Louis Quest Margot Hill. Hello, everyone. I am so thankful to be here, and I am honored to share with Spokane Falls Community College at your Intercultural Week here on campus. Today, I'm going to share with you a little bit of the history of the Spokane tribe. I have some slides that I'll be sharing, and hopefully they're advancing. I don't know if the slide shows up. So as we mentioned, I'm a Spokane tribal member, and I grew up on the Spokane Indian Reservation. As academics, we talk about sources of authority. My sources of authority is my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother. Today, we are here to honor Indigenous women, and so I talk to you from sources of authority. My great-grandmother was married to Thomas Gary, the son-nephew of Chief Spokane Gary, and my grandmother was an interpreter for chiefs. She spoke multiple Salish dialects, so I'm pleased to share with you a little bit of the Spokane history and the story of Huistox. So I'm going to talk to you about Spokane tribal history, treatment of the American Indian. There are so many things that we don't learn about in our grade schools. You know, a lot of us learn about Columbus, how in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We even learn that on the American Indian reservations. They teach us that in our tribal schools, and we don't always learn our own history. There are so many of the fundamental American liberties that all of us as citizens take for granted that was often enjoyed by everyone except the first Americans, except Indigenous people. When we talk about the separation of church and state, There was a separation of church and state for everybody but American Indians. Who did they send out to colonize the Indian reservation? They used our tribal dollars and paid churches to come out into our reservation to Christianize and to save the savages. So some of us are Presbyterians, others learned Catholicism. There was no separation of church and state when it came to the American Indian. The rights to assemble. If we were to talk about federal Indian history, we would talk about the state of Georgia and the Cherokee Nation. They threw their printing press into the water. They banished them from having tribal meetings. We had no right to assemble, according to Andrew Jackson, who then later became the United States president. We had no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion. Today, American Indians have to enact federal laws to have the basic fundamental liberties that all Americans enjoy the right to do those things. We have to have the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, ARFA, to protect our religious freedoms. We have to have the Indian Child Welfare Act just to have our right to parent our children protected. So again, these fundamental rights are enjoyed by all American citizens, but it's a continual battle for the American Indian. Here in Washington State, we have 29 tribes across the state. We have tribes surrounding all of the city of Spokane, yet we're often invisible. And ladies and gentlemen, that's quite intentional, that you do not see tribal people in this region. And I'm going to tell you that story today. So the Spokane people, we use this river as a lifeline. The river gives us our way of life. The salmon provided people with the critical food source. We gathered hundreds of tribal people that gathered at the falls, and we harvested the salmon. And we had traditional celebrations and ceremonies. The Spokane Falls drops a dramatic 130 feet, a half-mile stretch. And today we have a modern city, the city that we call the city of Spokane. There were 3 bands of the Spokanes, the upper, the middle, and the lower. The primary area for the lower, the Hangman Creek, the Latah Creek, and the Spokane Falls, east to the present day, the Washington-Idaho border. The middle Spokanes occupied the territory to the west of the falls of the Little Spokane River, and even further west, reaching as far as the confluence of the Spokanes, the Little Spokane. The Spokanes moved freely across the region, and members switched from bands to bands. We married amongst each other and lived and enjoyed our life with other tribes. Our tribal lands, we have a large expansive territory, but it has been reduced. But you can see it goes clear up north and clear down past Sprague to the Coeur d'Alene Reservation to Idaho. We had large territory, but it has been ceded to just a small area. We reserved those lands for ourselves. When you're learning about tribal history and tribal territories, remember that nobody gave Indian people land. We reserved those lands to ourselves. That's why it's called a reservation. For some tribes like the Yakima Nation, they ceded over 10 million acres to reserve their small portion of the reservation here in Washington State. The Spokane people, we shared our lands, we shared our salmon communally. The annual salmon runs ran in spring and in summer. Our reservation today is now located 40 miles northwest of here. The Spokane River and the Little Falls is where we first fished at Little Falls, the first fishery in the spring. Sometimes we constructed a rock barrier just below the falls to control the current and funnel the struggling salmon. This technology allowed Spokane fishermen to easily spear and harvest the salmon as salmon moved upriver. The Indians also moved to various locations along the river until we got here at the Spokane Falls, a beautiful spot where our people lived. We marked this harvest. We shared our salmon with the other tribes. We shared with tribes like the Coeur d'Alene, the Colville, the Palouse, the Kalispel. The other tribes came and enjoyed. We call our river Niquilquiltutin. Oh, the slides are not advancing. I'm supposed to point it somewhere certain. Keep going. Yes. Niquilquiltutin. The river gives us our way of life. The river was very much a part of us. It fed us. We had our ceremonies. We had a sweat house where we cleansed our spirits and souls and our bodies. We buried our people along the river. This was all part of our tribal cultural way. With the coming of the settlers, they began hydropower dams, and they blocked the salmons, and it cut off our way of life. But before that time, we had a salmon chief. The salmon chief, many of you guys can see a sculpture in downtown Spokane at what Washington Water Power at Vista calls Huntington Park. The ceremonial salmon chief, he supervised the fisheries, and he oversaw the distribution of the harvest. Some days there were 800 fish weighing more than 40 to 60 to 80 pounds. Our grandmothers would talk about the salmon, how it would hang off the saddle of the horse and almost touch the ground. 32,000 pounds of salmon could be harvested in one day. Our tribal people dried the salmon and preserved the salmon. We had special things that we put over the salmon so the flies wouldn't bother it. We had medicines, we had special science knowledge. Our fishing season. We had fishing seasons where we traveled throughout the Northwest along the Spokane River. This was a cultural event. Tribal people came from across the region to enjoy the fisheries. We had festivities and ceremonies, dancing, trading, gambling, gift giving, and horse racing. Thousands of Indians gathered around the Columbia Plateau and beyond, and they congregated at the Spokane Falls. There were other major fisheries, but these were our centers of commerce. These were an integral part of the Spokane way of life of our tribal people. And it remains to this very day. We still gather with our ceremonies and our powwows and our giveaways. We still have our Indian horse races. Now, we call it the Indian Horse Relay. We very much enjoy these pastimes. With our seasonal rounds, the Spokanes relied. In the winter, we had permanent villages. The Spokanes, the Little Spokane, provided shelter from the icy winter winds. The winter settlements had locations along Hayman Creek, just below Spokane Falls, and where the Spokane River receives the Little Spokane River. During the winter season, we had saved up and we had worked hard and we had food storages to get us through. Our tribal people, we dried the camas, the puchpuch, the berries, the vegetables. And by the mid-century, we often seen that we hunted during the winter. We had group expeditions. We would travel clear into the Montanas to get our buffalo and to trade with other tribes, the Salish Kootenai, and maybe the Flathead, the Blackfeet. But typically there was a lot of warring also with the Blackfeet Nation. We still do these things today. This picture is a picture of our tribal community gathering out on the prairie. We go to Coffee Pot Lake. It's out towards Harrington. Today, we don't own those lands. We have to talk to BLM and federal agencies to have access to the traditional areas that we dug camas. But our people, we gather. We sing songs. We bring our young children from all the schools and we have our petzas, our root diggers, and we gather the camas. We pray for the land, we pray for Mother Earth. We pray for all of the gifts from the Creator and that we will have a good season of food. That is how our grandmothers taught us. That is what we know. So the Spokane tribe, as we emerged from our permanent villages, we hunted game. The Spokanes burned fields sometimes, and we marched from March to May. Women harvested the roots and camas. Spokane women harvested bitterroot. There was a lot of things that was found. If you're the Coeur d'Alenes, you talk about the water potatoes, but there are many gifts from Mother Earth that tribal people subsisted upon. Our first foods, as we call them. You can see here that we gather on these prairies still today. This is a picture of my niece and I digging the puk-puk, our camas. Our young children gift the roots to our tribal elders. Here's a picture of a young man gifting to Eva Boyd. She's a Salish Kootenai and Spokane tribal elder. She drives clear from Montana to gather with our people to collect these roots. Our little people honor their tribal elders. We have done these things since time immemorial. These were our traditions, our cultural teachings until the settlers came. Our word for white person is Suyapi. It is not derogatory. It simply means upside down face. When we first encountered the settlers, they were fur traders, and we didn't understand that they had very little hair on their head and all this beard, so we called them upside down face. This invasion began in the 1800s when French Canadian fur traders working the Northwest Fur Company entered into the Spokane region. The Spokanes treated the traders kindly, despite the epidemic of diseases and the death that was brought with these foreigners. We suffered great losses through the 1780s and into the early 19th century. Shortly after arriving, they set up the Northwest Fur Company, and we've seen that if you look at any of our histories, but we also have an oral history. My great-grandmother talked about how our people hid in the woods and watched these Suyapis for some time. They were curious creatures, very different from what we knew. By 1810, we see people like Jocko Finley entering the area, and we have the Spokane House. The Northwest Company was instructing and building a post near the Spokane River. In this Spokane country, they told them, go ahead and build your little fort along here at the confluence. This will be a good place for us to trade. We welcomed the Suyapis. We were welcoming and open-hearted. But then we began to have conflict. We see from 1800 to 1855, the Spokanes coexisted with the white traders and the missionaries that came into their lands. White miners began to flood Indian territory up from Spokane to Colville, and tensions began to rise. In 1857, we see Colonel Steptoe beginning to march into the Spokane tribal territory. The women were gathering camas and digging roots, and we could see that these soldiers had guns. They said, oh, we're making peace, but we've seen their guns, we've seen their cannons. We were quite concerned. And so the men and our warriors rallied, and we battled Steptoe because he was not coming in peace with guns and cannons. We battled the Spokanes, the Palouse, the Yakimas, the Coeur d'Alenes. Our people gathered together to protect our families and to protect our homelands. We defeated Steptoe, and we defeated them in this first battle. The evening began to set, and tribal people did not believe in fighting at night. Whether it was they didn't want their spirits to, if they believed their spirits may get lost in the dark, but they settled down for the night. There were some scouts, some Nez Perce scouts that came and helped Steptoe and a few of the soldiers that survived get away and get back to Fort Walla Walla. This story got clear back to Washington, D.C., and Congress and folks said, we will not have these little tribal people defeating the United States. So they sent more money. They sent more guns, bigger technology. there was roughly 3/4 of all the troops in the Northwest Territory that was rounded up to fight against the United Forces of the Spokanes, the Coeur d'Alenes, the Yakima, the Palouse. And that's when we see the entry of Colonel Wright. Colonel Wright came in and he brought his troops and he began to commit genocide. He battled the Spokanes, chased them clear off from Airway Heights through here up to the campus that we're now standing on. The tribal people, the warriors tried to push back the troops. They lit fires across the prairie to keep the troops back from the villages of women and children and elders. But the US soldiers, they kept coming. Colonel Wright was bent on defeating the tribal people, the indigenous people of this land. He had bigger guns that could shoot further. We were not prepared for this increased military strength. Finally, our warriors had fought with all they had, but they were defeated by Colonel Wright. Wright went on a military campaign. He burned our food storages. He burned down our villages. He slaughtered our horses. Out in the valley, there are monuments that mark the location where he slaughtered our horses. But he had embarked on this expedition, and he told his troops to kill all of our horses because that was a way to get at us. We know in the plains, they killed the buffalo, not for food, but to attack the military power. That was the heart and soul of the Lakota people. For us, our horses were very important. And our tribal elders talked about how Colonel Wright, they began, and you can read this in the journals of the soldiers, that out at the location out by Liberty Lake, out the state line, the marker, they began shooting the horses, and then they didn't want to waste the bullets. And so they began clubbing the horses. And that is when some of the military soldiers found some humanity because they looked into the eye of the horses as they were clubbing them, and it was more than they could take. That day, there were 900 head of horses. 100 they kept for themselves, the best horses the United States cavalry kept for themselves. The rest they slaughtered. And our Spokane River ran red with the blood of our horses. For years later, our tribal elders talked about that location. When that was happening, the Indian people, they hid up in the mountains, and they watched the soldiers, the United States cavalry, and they could not understand the brutality. Why would you kill a horse? Man-to-man combat, but why would you kill a horse? They did nothing. And so for years, the bones laid in that field, and you could see when you came into that area, you could see the ground. It shimmered like it moved. It was the bleaching bones of our horses. And we think about those stories today. Our tribal elders tell those histories today. But Colonel Wright was not a hero. He was on a campaign of genocide. Again, he burned our food storages. And then he began hanging our tribal leaders. He hung Qual Shan and Al Hai without regard to their life. Many Indians, they lined up where we now have Hangman Creek. He hung our leaders. Don Cutler writes a book that some of you have had the opportunity to read. And he tells the story, Hang Them All. That was Colonel Wright's intention. He led unnecessarily violent military actions against the tribes and the native peoples. His behavior was a curse. Wright's legacy was not of greatness. And this legacy has slowly been degrading under the weight of time. And now we have been able to change this street. We no longer honor the shocking inhumanity of Wright, where he slaughtered our horses. Donald Cutler tries to make sense of the question of why Spokane continued to honor this man for all of these years. As Indigenous people, we ask this question: why would this city continue to honor? Since the 1990s, Red Nation students have fought to change the name. SFCC staff like Pam Austin worked to change the name. Faculty like Barry Moses worked to change the name. It has taken all this time to retell the story, to get closer to the truth. This again, I encourage you to read Hang Them All, the story of George Wright by Don Cutler. I want to tell you a little bit of the oral history that is passed down. Next slide, please. This is, we gathered out here this past year, and one of our tribal elders, Jim Saijon, came and shared. He told the story that had been passed down through oral history that he had heard from the Coeur d'Alene camps. The tribal people had heard word that the soldiers were coming. And the camps were buzzing. People were getting ready. They were sending runners to the next camp to tell them that there were soldiers coming. A campman was arising, and the women were running to get the men lances and bows and shields and helping the warriors and hooking it onto their horses. The women were getting the men ready for battle. And again, they sent out the word to the villages that the soldiers were here. The men began preparing throughout the night. They put on the medicine on the campfire, and they began putting on their paint. Early in the morning, they started out to face the soldiers. The soldiers had gone far into their territory. The women warriors, the women also prepared. We had medicines that we used to heal our bodies. When people were hurt, we had medicines. And so we began to put up our camps, our medics, our shelters, and gather our medicines. When the battle began, as a soldier went down, there were Indigenous Native women that would race out and pick up that soldier, get him on the horse, and ride them back to the camp. Time after time, Indigenous Native women would pick up those wounded soldiers and bring them back to the medic shelter. Then finally, she got shot. Shinshiman. Oh, then she got shot, and the warrior picked her up. And then a warrior rode out, picked her up, and took her back towards the medic shelter. And an Indigenous woman from the medic camp rode out and met him, and they exchanged and rode her back. And the warrior went back into battle. These people were simply trying to protect their lands, protect their families, protect their villages. They say when that Indigenous woman died, she was singing her medicine song. We still sing the songs of our ancestors today. We sing the Hangman Creek song, the Hangman song. When one of the warriors, when they were lining up our people, our warriors went against cannons and rifles. And then they fought hand to hand, but again, it was just to protect their family and their way of life. At Hangman Creek, where they finally hung some of our leaders, Colonel Wright lined up the Indians, women, children, brothers, sisters, and the warriors. He lined them up and he said, you, and you, and you. and he hung our people indiscriminately. And they called it their justice when they did their justice. One warrior stood and he sang his medicine song. And he said to his people, I give you this song. You are going to have hard times, and this song will be medicine for you. And he sang the Hangman Song. We still sing that song today. 150 years later, we sing that song. We gathered out here at the rally, and we had lots of good people of all colors. We had Chinese professors from this school, from EWU, from SFCC. We had Muslims, we had African Americans, we had white allies, all that stood to change the name from Fort George Wright. And our tribal language house came, our tribal leaders. We organized the rally and we were so careful because we're in the middle of the pandemic. We did not want to jeopardize our tribal elders. But they came anyway. They came from the Yakima Nation. They came from the Colville Nation, Dr. Mike Marchand. They came from the Coeur d'Alene tribe. Tribal council, they came and they spoke. Our tribal elders told their stories. We had bear cubs that are descendants of Qualshan that stood here and spoke about the history and told the story of Colonel Wright and hanging our warriors. We sang that song, the Hangman Creek Song. The Spokane tribe worked with the Spokane City Council to change the name. We chose to honor women, warrior women. Huistox. Her name means walks in a dress. The Spokane tribe wants to not only honor those warrior women of the 1800s, but they honor the women of today, the women that are the backbones of our family, the women warriors who fight daily to protect and preserve our culture, our lifeways, our families. Today in our city, the city benefits from Indigenous women. We have Native nurses. We have Native educators and professors and lawyers and Indigenous women that run our urban centers, that provide healthcare, that provide vaccinations in this time of the pandemic. I want to tell you about Huistox. She was the daughter of Chief Palopkin and the wife of Qualshan. Qualshan was a Yakima warrior, and so this marriage union brought peace and stability to our region. Their family was known for their intelligence and their good looks, and her beauty was famous. Huistox, again, her name means walks in a dress. She rode alongside her husband, Qualshan. They wore their best regalia as they rode into Colonel Wright's camp. Huistox carried the staff. Typically, it's men, medicine men, and chiefs who wore the staff. But it was Qualshan's practice to have Huistox carry the medicine staff. The Yakimas tell the story of how, as Qualshan's wife, Huistox, began cutting her way through the soldiers. Huistox herself told the story. The moment when she seen the soldiers enter the tent, grab her husband, and put a rope over his head and shoulders. She tried to cut one soldier with a knife. Escaping, the soldier kicked her knife out of her hands, and they were overpowered. She saw that rope go over Qualshan's head, and she started to run out of camp. There is a portrait that is painted of Huistox. This is by Nona Hagen. And it is a nice depiction of Huistox as she threw her spear in the ground as an act of defiance. She was not succumbing to the United States soldiers. She was a warrior woman. And she rode out of camp. So we honor our warrior women. I want to tell you, as we move forward, a little bit more history. Again, Queestox is just legendary, that she was strong and lived past these battles. She traveled to buffalo hunts east of the Rockies, and where battles with the Blackfeet were common. And she lived her years at her last years at the edge of the mouth of the Spokane. Our people continue to struggle, and we continue to fight. We have suffered through many things. I want to tell you a little bit about our boarding school experience. This is a portrait of a group of Spokane Indians that were sent to Forest Grove, a boarding school. Our Chief Lott, wanted to have a school on the reservation. He had heard of other tribes getting schools. And so just after the establishment of the Spokane Indian Reservation, this was in 1881, President Rutherford B. Hayes established the Spokane Indian Reservation. We reserved those lands to ourselves. Spokaneans were forced to relocate, not in the beautiful falls of the Spokane that we have always known and lived and thrived, but up into the mountains, the territory that nobody wanted, that the settlers didn't want. Chief Lott finally got this reservation, the lands he reserved unto himself. But he asked for a school, and they finally said, "We will send some of your children to this boarding school." These are the young children that were sent to the boarding school. And I could tell you many stories about the Forest Grove and the other boarding schools. But there are pictures that you can see the before and after. Here were children that were learning the ways of their people, running in the mountains and learning the medicines and the foods that would sustain their people. They were sent to the Forest Grove boarding school. They had soft, supple deerskin moccasins traded for tight leather boots, collars up to your neck, uncomfortable clothing. Children, their hair was cut. They were beaten for speaking their language. Of all these children that went to the Forest Grove, and I'm going to read some of their names: Alice Williams, Florence Hayes, Suzette Sika, Julia Jopps, Louis Isaacs, Eunice Madge, James George, Ben Sika, Frank Rice, and Garfield Hayes. These are names of our people that still live today. My family was close with Willie Hayes. We spent all of our holidays. He was on a full-blooded Spokane Indian that was on our tribal council. These were his ancestors. Of those children that were sent to the boarding school, of Chief Lott's people, they didn't want their children to go to the boarding school, but because Chief Lott sees the value of education, he wanted to send his kids, wanted them to go, and he convinced these families for their children to go. And they sent their children to Forest Grove in Oregon. Of these children, only 5 came home. And those that did return to the reservation, they also later died. So this was a mistake for our people. Boarding schools were hard on us. Chief Lott wanted an education for his people. We were progressive. We wanted the knowledge. But again, it didn't happen, so he fought to have a school finally built on the reservation so we wouldn't have to send our children to boarding school. Next, I just want to tell you a little bit about Spokane Gary. Chief Spokane Gary, he was the son of Ilumicum, the chief of the Spokanes, born in 1811. Spokane Gary, many of you know his story. He walked 1,800 miles up into Canada to the Red River School. The European settler said, "Let us educate your children. Let us take and we'll make them strong and smart." And the chief said, "We're not going to give you just anybody will give you our own sons. So it was Chief Spokane Gary and Kootenai Pelly that was brought 1800. They walked behind the priests on horses, the pastors on horses. He learned to speak English. He learned to speak French. He was a diplomat, and he helped settle all this territory. Chief Spokane Gary was a friend to the whites, and he helped keep settlers safe in these tribal nations. One day he was up fishing in Kettle Falls, where we still gather today. We gather with the Colvilles and the Coeur d'Alenes and the Kalispels. We gather and we have what we call the ceremony of tears. And we remember the fishing that was at Kettle Falls. But on this day, Spokane Gary was up at the Kettle Falls fishing so he could sustain himself for the winter, gathering his food. At that day, his home was stolen. There was a white settler that came in and claimed his property. Here was a man who had done everything for white settlers, and nobody stood up for him. The settler said, "You'll have 3 days." And then he didn't even wait for that. He burned down Chief Gary's log home. And the people that testified and signed the papers were the very people that this city praises. Glover. Glover signed those papers. And the city sheriff. From this time on, it was very clear that tribal people were not welcome in our own city. The erasure of indigenous people. You know, there has been many atrocities against indigenous people. My own grandmother, in the 50s, she was a waitress at the Davenport Hotel. She was married, and when her and her husband bought a home, her brown brothers moved her in. The neighbors freaked out, and they called the owner of the home, who canceled the sale. So it may not be clear that there were sundown laws or restricted covenants that ran with the land. But it was clear to tribal people that they were not welcome in their own city. Our grandmothers told story about how in their horse and buggy, they had to be to the far edge of town before nightfall because they were not welcome here in the city. EW history professor Dr. Larry Sabula talks about the lynchings of tribal people, of indigenous people from here to Cheney. And so we know about the erasure of indigenous people. We can tell these stories. We can tell this settler colonial history, the American genocide that happened right here. Today, we want to get closer to the truth. I am so thankful to be here at Spokane Falls Community College. Today, we stand on the location that was the battlefield between the United States Cavalry and the Spokanes, the Coeur d'Alenes, the Palouse, and the Colville. Today, we recognize Intercultural Week here at SFCC. We recognize all the culture. Each of you have a culture. Each of you, your family has a history, and you have a story to tell. I encourage you, let's celebrate all cultures. We reject the stomping out of cultures so that not just one dominant can come in and take over. This was the story of Colonel George Wright, what he attempted to do. And it was the Spokane Falls Community College Red Nation student group and Native staff like Pam Austin and faculty like Barry Moses who worked to change the name. I've talked to some of your staff who sat on committees. For 20 years, they talked about changing the name. And so we are proud as a Spokane tribe, our tribal council worked with the city council. And today, we honor Shinmin Shin, the woman warrior, Queestops, indigenous women that rode into battle, that rescued wounded men. We remember and honor the work of women who fight for the environment, like Debbie Abrahamson,
and Twila Abrahamson, who fought the contamination of mining companies on our reservation clear to the Navajo Nation. We honor the indigenous nurses, the Native women that are nurses for our city. We honor the tribal teachers and the faculty and those that are on the school board, and the women, the indigenous women that serve as the backbone for their family. And today, we remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a staunch advocate for equality and women's rights. And she quoted the women's rights activist Sarah Moore Greenkey when she said, "I ask for no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is to get and to take their feet off our necks." Today, we recognize the struggle of the BIPOC, the Black, Indigenous people of color. Sometimes it is a crime driving white, Black, or brown. Today, we remember the murder of George Floyd, and we stand with our Black brothers and sisters and we say, "Get your knee off our neck." Here on this land, it was a battlefield for the Spokane, the Palouse, the Yakima, and the Coeur d'Alenes. And they fought to protect their families and their families. We remember that all of us as students and faculty, we have battlefields in our own lives. We all have scars. Sometimes we go through a hard struggle to get our education. Maybe growing up you didn't have parents, or maybe you had a parent in jail. Well, I tell you, you've got grit. If you have one person that believed in you, if it was your grandma, if it was a teacher, if it was a counselor, you can do it. You can be a warrior and be anything you want to be. I started at community college, at Edmonds Community College, before I had a bachelor's degree or a Juris Doctorate or later a master's in urban planning. It was at the community college. You as students are here on your journey, and you will have your own battlefields. Maybe you're a single parent struggling to pay for daycare. Maybe you're trying to schedule classes so you can pick up your children after school. Maybe you can't even start your homework until your children are in bed. Yes, it can be a battle to get your education. So we here at Intercultural Week at SFCC, we think about these things. And sometimes we recognize that our criminal justice system is broken. Just 2 weeks ago, my best friend had to bury her son. He was in an altercation with the Spokane City Police. He turned the gun on himself. Last week, my niece hung herself in Lincoln County Jail. And our hearts are broken. And we think about this today, and we think about the big pharmaceutical companies that made millions and billions off of these drugs. And we think that maybe the wrong people are in jail. So we say, get your knee off our necks. Keep your pharmaceuticals away from our families. And today we are making change. We are making progress. You are the next generation. We see here U.S. Congresswomen that are our warrior women. We say Deb Holland, a Laguna Pueblo. We see Sharice Davids from Kansas. She's a Winnebago. We also have federal judges, Diane Humtiwa, a Hopi. And here in Washington State, the Supreme Court Justice, Raquel Montoya, also Indigenous woman. We now have the first Native American Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland. Who we elect matters. Who we vote into office matters. We are coming together as a nation. We have work to do. We still have poverty and homelessness, and we have a mental health crisis. As professionals and academics, we call these social determinants of health. We have work to do. We cannot put our people into jail and just throw them in the criminal justice system.
During this pandemic, we have seen that it's the people of color that are hit first and hit the worst. And again, with the climate change, it's people of color that are hit first and hit the worst. All of you are the future generations. Your voices are powerful. You are here at SFCC getting your education. You are doing the work. And I'll close with this thought. As my buddy Reverend Stone from the Morning Star Baptist Church said, know your strength. You cannot know your strength if you do not have struggles. You will have challenges. You might be admired one moment, and you might take a nosedive the next. So know your strength. You need to name it, claim it, and sometimes blame it. What is your struggle? Maybe you don't have enough money to pay for your tuition. So we encourage you to apply for scholarships. Maybe your family doesn't understand your sacrifice to go to school. But keep studying, keep making the sacrifice. As I said, I started at community college. I drove my grandpa's 66 Chevy truck with the stick shift to the park and ride before I went to UW. If you have no struggles, you won't know your strength. Your struggles will make you strong. You may get knocked down, but you can get back up. Sheen are women warriors. We honor these women like Quiz Talks, and we honor you, the students who are fighting for your education. You are future generations, and so I say, know your strength and be strong. Lamlaps, she'ohoy.
Thank you.
I think we have some time for questions. And Darlene, if you want to share questions from the chat.
We forgot to mention that if you had questions throughout, you could put it in the chat. And so I didn't see many. So what we can do now is we can just open it up if you want to unmute and ask a question. We've got some time for that. I'm going to ask one.
Okay.
Tell us about, you're talking about women warriors, and I know you taught before about our missing and murdered Indigenous women, and tell me about what you're wearing, and especially about your skirt.
Okay. So I'm wearing my ribbon skirt today as part of our awakening for Indigenous culture, so people recognize some of our struggles. We have been wearing ribbon skirts to bring attention to murdered, missing Indigenous women. So often our regalia is part of our tribal ceremony. We have, buckskin dresses, we have wing dresses, we have all sorts of regalia that we wear. Our women have been wearing red skirts and ribbon skirts to bring attention. There's a lot of Indigenous women that go missing and are murdered, and it's an epidemic. And so we have been working hard, sometimes marching, sometimes having ceremonies and gathering across the state to bring attention to one of these issues. Indigenous women suffer more violence and rape than any other race or ethnicity, and we want to make sure that people are aware of this issue and looking for our women, that law enforcement's looking, and folks across the state are taking note. We have a state representative, Deborah Leathenoff, who now represents Washington State. We have in the Washington State Patrol, we have 2 tribal liaisons, Patty Ghosh on the west side for Murdered Missing Indigenous Women Issues, and Dawn Pullen here from Eastern Washington. So we're doing a lot to bring attention to these issues. And just one of them is our traditional regalia, our ribbon skirts.
Okay, thank you.
A small question about Wistox herself. You had mentioned that she spent the later part of her life up by the confluence of the Spokane River. Did she remarry, have children, or?
We don't know that. We have oral history that told her life stories. It's my understanding that there are descendants, but it's hard to track people from 150 years ago. You know, we know the oral history, but I'm not exactly sure if she remarried. It would have been a long time, I'm sure. You know, from Qualshan, the Yakima warrior, that she loved so dearly.
And did we know quite a little bit about her encounter with George Wright. Did she elaborate perhaps in any kind of writings or just the oral?
Yeah, no, just oral history that she talked about escaping from the soldiers, that she grabbed the saber or knife and was trying to cut her way out. And then that she escaped. One soldier kicked one of the weapons out, but she got on her horse, and the picture that we have is her reeling her horse around and then throwing the staff into the ground. So very defiant, very strong and indigenous.
And it's my understanding from that book that they had been deceived to even enter the camp.
Yeah, they came under a peace flag, and then they said, you know, he lured them in by saying, "We have your father, Alhai." So there was lots of trickery, you know, Qualshan thought he was negotiating peace, but within 15 minutes, Colonel Wright had him hung. The soldiers surrounded him and he escaped. We have oral history that our grandmothers talk about that he broke loose the chains a number of times until more and more soldiers could subdue him.
And that happened at Hangman Valley, right? That's why it's named Hangman Valley?
Yeah. You know, I just got to say that I really appreciate our current leadership at the City Council, the Planning Commission. You know, this has been a long road to get this name change. First, it was the Red Nation students here at Spokane Falls Community College that worked to get it changed, along with the faculty like Barry Moses and Pam Austin. You know, we just so appreciate the work and the support that Pam Austin gave to our students. My brother attended Spokane Falls Community College, so I appreciate that. And it was a lot of people. It was all the tribes coming together. There were decisions made by the Caldwell Tribal Council that talked to their culture committee, the Yakima Nation, the descendants of Qualshan were here at the rally. So it was a lot of work, and there were 42 organizations across the city that wrote to City Council and the City Planning Commission supporting the efforts to change the name. There were churches along this roadway, Life Center, our pastor, Joe Whittier. If you could imagine, he said, you know, I never thought about the name, but it's like if, for Jewish people, if it was Adolf Hitler Boulevard, nobody would tolerate that. Nobody would, you know, would allow that to go on. But here we overlook the American genocide and the story that we have in our own city. And so I'm real thankful for the City Council, the Planning Commission, and our tribal leadership. You know, the City Council deferred to the Spokane tribe, and the tribe spoke with tribal elders and then talked to all the other tribes to honor women warriors. And so I appreciate the current leadership. It was a long, long road.
What do you think are some of the caveats that today's society can do to honor and include the history of the Spokane?
So having teach-ins, much like we're doing today, reading the books by Don Cutler, Hang Them All. There's another book coming out on Spokane Gary. To be woke, to understand the true history of our city, and then to support people of color. When we think about, we call them social determinants of health. We have homelessness and poverty. As I said, for many years, our people were not welcome in the city of Spokane. So supporting programs and what you do here at Spokane Falls Community College, educating and supporting young tribal people. You know, how hard, I had messages from tribal people that came to school here and they knew the history. And how hard was it for those students to come to school every day on Fort George Wright Drive? What a slap in the face. How hurtful was that? I would go to church at the Life Center and come out of church with a prayerful attitude, only to be faced with George Wright Boulevard. So put yourself in people's shoes, people of color. But I ask you to support these programs, education that helps. Education gives people opportunity. And that's all we're asking for is an opportunity.
And one final question I have, I know that there was a confluence in the 20s down by the Spokane River, just below Monroe Street Bridge. And it celebrated the salmon runs and all of that. And I was wondering, is it possible that that might be a unification point to have a powwow that involves Spokane City and maybe even Riverfront Park?
So we do have ceremonies at that location. We still gather there in private ceremonies.
Mhm.
But down at Riverfront Park, we gather the powwow, the gathering of at the falls is what we call it. So every weekend, the weekend before Labor Day, which is our Spokane Indian powwow out on the reservation, the weekend before Labor Day, we have a powwow called Gathering at the Falls. And tribes come from Montana, Idaho, all over Washington, Oregon. Then they come, and for that weekend, we reclaim our indigenous lands. We take over Riverfront Park, we camp there, we sing there, our young children play there. And so again, I encourage folks to be welcoming to people of color, for that we don't have to be invisible, to be welcomed here on campus, that when we have our powwow here at Spokane Falls Community College, those little tribal kids running around playing, that's the best thing you can do, because they can feel at home at this institution, if you will, at this educational facility, and then have opportunity.
Margo, we have a question in chat. This is from Ping Ping. First, she says, thank you so much, Dr. Hill. When you said your knowledge is from authority and they are your great grandma and mother, I would like you to ask, that in your culture traditions, are women considered the authority figures more than men? What is the decision-making process in your tribe?
I actually write an article about Indigenous women leadership. We talked about that there was a lot of our tribal cultures that was very much matrilineal. And everything, when European settlers came, they just did not understand that women would have such influence and power. So when they started doing the allotment, you know, after the Dawes Act, it was heads of household, mostly men. And so women were dispossessed of their property right by United States federal Indian policy, right? On our tribal councils, those are organizations that were created by the Indian Civil Rights Act. Again, an American institution that was handed down that wasn't our traditional tribal way. Yes, we had tribal chiefs, but yes, women were very influential. When I served as the tribe's attorney, we had a woman, the female CFO. We now have a chairwoman, Carol Evans, who is a CPA, you know, has her degrees from Eastern Washington University, is a certified public accountant and a chairwoman of our tribe. The head of our clinic, it was a female for many years. The head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs of our particular Bureau of Indian Affairs agency, Marcella Teeters, a tribal female. So our Indigenous women, our roles have changed. Often, again, confronted with those European, Eurocentric policies, our places were diminished. But Indigenous women are fighting back for our positions of leadership. As I said, I served as the tribe's attorney. I've given you examples of federal court judges that are Native Indigenous women. The highest, the cabinet, the secretary of the Department of Interior, Deborah Holland of Laguna Pueblo. So Indigenous women are taking our place and serving our people. And that's one reason why the Spokane tribe wanted to honor Huistocs, but not just the women warriors of the 1800s. Here in the city of Spokane, we have Indigenous nurses. I can name them, Jamie and Jolene, and our Indigenous women that are serving this city. Jenny Stilego's on the school board. We have my aunt Sophie Tenasket was the director of the Indian Center, served the American Indian community for many years. Tony Lodge is the head of the Native Project. Native Health, our Native Health was vaccinating non-Indian teachers from the reservation. During this pandemic, it's our Native Health organizations that have been vaccinating all of the populations. So thank you for that question, Ping. I appreciate that.
I have a question. I want to go back to when you were speaking about the Indian Child Welfare Act and how we were looked at as less than human. Now, we weren't even allowed to speak our language. We had to have a law passed in 1990 for us to be able to speak our language. And our language almost died because of that, the Salish language, correct?
Yeah. So you bring up some really good points, Sage. So as I mentioned, clear up from the boarding school era, and I made a specific point to show those pictures from the Forest Grove School, that our children were taken away. We have oral history where our tribal elders like Jim Saijan talks about his great-grandmother when they were loading up our children and taking them away in wagons. Well, that continued from the 1800s right up until the 1970s when we were finally able to pass the Indian Child Welfare Act. This has disrupted our family systems. Why do our people struggle? Why do we have issues with alcohol and drugs? Because our family systems were broken by both the boarding schools right up until today. They called it the 70s scoop. From all across the United States to the First Nations in Canada, Indigenous children were put in foster homes. I even ended up in a foster home. It's a scary, crazy feeling to be with people who aren't your family. There's pictures on Netflix. I warn you before you watch it, Indian Horse. That really tells the story of boarding schools. But again, I warn you that it's pretty intense. But it disrupted our family systems. That's why our kids have such a hard time. That's why when they come to the colleges, they need support because they are first generation in some cases, the first person in the family to go to college. And our family systems were disrupted. My mom was raised by my great-grandmother, because part of the, I do entire lectures on this, but the relocation period, my grandparents, Peter B. Tenasket and Ida Pion Boyd were in Seattle when my mom was born because of the war, but they were relocated to cities. And your family systems, your culture systems are all disrupted. And you have this historical trauma where, it's taking generations to get back to that. So our students need support when they come here to college. Yeah, great question, great point. And the Indian Child Welfare Act allows a tribe to intervene and give a preference for where a child is placed. If you remove a child, that tribe has to be notified if they're an Indigenous child. It can be placed with their family or somebody else from that tribe. It gives us a preference, but it's getting challenged at courts today.
Yeah, it is. I'm going through it with my nephew.
Okay, I think we're.
Okay, well, again, I just want to thank you all for having me here today. Thank you all of you who are online and listening. Lem Lunch, Shetwahoy, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Margo.
Thank you for being here.